Welcome back to a new lecture. This is number 13, topic 2.6, Slavery in the British Colonies. The theme here is work, exchange, and technology. This will cover the labor systems that were used in the colonies and how they affected society overall. Our learning objective is explain the causes and effects of slavery in the British colonial regions. This is the first of two learning objectives that we have here today. We'll begin with the causes and then delve into the effects of the use of slavery throughout. There are two key concepts for this learning objective, but we'll break up the first one into several parts as it's very long. The first part says, all the British colonies participated to varying degrees in the Atlantic slave trade due to the abundance of land and a growing European demand for colonial goods, as well as a shortage of indentured servants. Indentured servitude was a system in which people would willingly sell themselves into labor for 5 to 7 years in exchange of someone paying their passage across the Atlantic. At the end of their contract, the indentured servant could get land out of the deal, or they would get some supplies from the person who they've sold their labor to, and then they could start their own plantation with that supplies. That was the most profitable way in order to get labor in the British colonies because it rewarded the plantation owners with more land. A major crop was tobacco, and it lent itself to this system of labor. Tobacco was considered a poor man's crop because anyone could grow tobacco in a field of any size with very low overhead, meaning that they didn't really have to put that much money or invest in a lot of labor in order to grow it to make a profit. Though the profit margin began to shrink over time because so many people were growing tobacco. Buying an enslaved person for the primary means of labor on a tobacco farm did not make financial sense. It required a large upfront financial cost that would take a long time to be made up if the farm was not large enough. Meanwhile, sugarcane was supposed to be the rich man's crop because it took a very large operation in order to get the sugarcane to be grown, refined into sugar, and then shipped out to Europe. The profit margins were also larger than that of tobacco, though it took a lot more money to get started. That's why in the Caribbean and the West Indies, the enslaved labor was much more common. But as land began to grow scarce in the colonies, indentured servants stopped receiving as much or as favorable land at the end of their contract. They grow unhappy, and unhappiness leads to Bacon's Rebellion. This is a turning point for the growth of chattel slavery. The first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia in 1619, but it won't become widespread until the late 1600s. Other factors that led to that increase in the use of enslaved labor was that American farmers or British colonist farmers began to turn to new crops like rice and indigo. Rice needed to be grown in a specific way that required special knowledge. Enslaved Africans were more likely to have this agricultural knowledge, as some had grown rice in West Africa themselves. There was also an increase in wages in England, which meant that there's going to be fewer people trying to sell themselves into indentured servitude. And finally, the end of the monopoly that the Royal African Company held in 1684 over the slave trade. They just could not keep up with the demand for enslaved labor, and so therefore enslaved Africans sold by the Royal African Company were very expensive for plantation owners to purchase. After they lose their monopoly, new private dealers can jump into the slave trade and increase the amount of enslaved Africans. By increasing the supply, the price of an enslaved laborer is going to go down. The next part of the key concept is small New England farms used relatively few enslaved laborers. All port cities held significant minorities of enslaved people, and the immersion plantation system of the Chesapeake and the southern Atlantic coast had large numbers of enslaved workers. The map shows that enslaved people made up a high percentage of the total population in the southern plantations, and they also held a higher number overall of enslaved people than the northern colonies of New England and the middle colonies. In Virginia and South Carolina, by 1750, at least half of the population was enslaved. Georgia had been the last colony chartered in the 1730s and tried to keep slavery out of it, but that did not last very long, and eventually, as you can see, a high proportion of the people in Georgia by 1750 were enslaved. Just because it was more prominent in the southern colonies, it doesn't mean that it did not exist in the middle colonies or in the northern New England colonies. This is underscored by the 1741 conspiracy. This was a supposed plot to overthrow the white settlement and population of New York City. Because it was uncovered before it was to take place, 17 enslaved Africans were executed and were burnt at the stake for supposedly being involved in this conspiracy. Whether or not there was an actual conspiracy to overthrow the white people in New York is not fully known, but the fear of such an insurrection was enough for the white population in New York City to revolt and see the black enslaved population as suspicious. The last part of this key concept says, while the great majority of enslaved Africans were sent to the West Indies. This is to underscore that the total amount of enslaved Africans that made it to the British colonies in North America were actually a minority of all enslaved Africans that were sent to North and South America. An estimated 10 million were sent from Africa, and about 2.5 million died in transit. 4.8 million went to the West Indies, 360 to 600,000 went to North America. Now, the estimates may differ, and the reason why the West Indies ended up importing more enslaved Africans is because life expectancy was lower in those sugar colonies. They were more exposed to the elements, it was harder work, and so therefore they had a lower life expectancy. As enslaved Africans on these sugar plantations continued to die, they would import more and more. In the British colonies, they had better weather. The labor of planting tobacco or rice or indigo was not as strenuous as planting sugarcane, and so therefore they had a slightly better life expectancy in the British North American colonies. The further north that one travels through the British colonies, life expectancy goes up. Just as it did for the white population in those colonies, it did so for the enslaved population. Another reason why there was not as many enslaved Africans imported from Africa to North America is because eventually a domestic slave trade is going to develop, and enslaved people will be bred to produce more enslaved laborers. Slave codes will be written in North American British colonies so that slavery becomes an inherited status. Thus, all of the offspring of enslaved Africans can also be sold into slavery. It becomes more of a self-sustaining institution than it was in the West Indies, which is why it required less imports from West Africa. The last key concept for this learning objective deals with slave codes. As chattel slavery became the dominant labor system in many southern colonies, new lands created a strict racial system that prohibited interracial relationships and defined the descendants of African American mothers as black and enslaved in perpetuity. Black codes arose because of a fear that white colonists would be outnumbered, as they eventually did in the southern colonies. They wanted a way to maintain control of the behaviors of the black enslaved laborers. These codes were based on the previous codes that were used in the Caribbean. The Barbados Slave Code of 1661 becomes the basis for the British colonist slave codes. Massachusetts becomes the first colony to recognize enslavement in 1661 and recognize people as property. But in the 1690s, South Carolina enacts their slave codes, and then they will become the basis for further slave codes in the colonies. It puts the restraints on enslaved population. It forbids them from learning to read and write, from holding any weapons, from interacting with the white population without proper permission, and all of these were enforced by the white population, even if the white population did not own any enslaved Africans. It was forced upon the entire society in order to try and keep control of the enslaved laborers. The Virginia slave codes were the first ones to make slavery a status to be inherited. The wording of the law said that the offspring of an enslaved woman will follow the status of the mother. Thus, there would be no dispute about the freedom or enslavement of a child, as paternity was difficult to prove. One other key thing that came from the Barbados Slave Code in 1661 is the clause that it indemnified colonists or enslavers from accidentally killing enslaved people. It said, "It is further enacted and ordained that if any Negro or other slave under punishment by his master unfortunately shall suffer in life or member, which seldom happens, no person whatsoever shall be liable to any fine therefor." That means that if an enslaver was brutally beating an enslaved person for something that they had done or not done, and that punishment resulted in the death of the enslaved person, it would not count as murder, and there would be no punishment for the enslaver whatsoever. The second learning objective of this topic says, explain how enslaved people responded to slavery. The only key concept is Africans developed both overt and covert means to resist the dehumanizing nature of slavery and maintain their family and gender systems, culture, and religion. Overt means that it is being done outright, that it is visible, while covert means that it's being done secretly. There were instances of covert resistance in which enslaved people were trying to undermine the control of the enslavers. They would break tools, they would fake being sick, or they would work slowly. Some of these means of resistance ended up feeding into stereotypes enslavers held for enslaved Africans. They would confuse a person being sick or working slowly to mean that they were lazy or weak. It grew into stereotypes about black enslaved people that would continue and be held by plantation owners and enslavers for generations to come. Other ways in which enslaved people would secretly try to resist their enslavement is that they would try to continue to practice their traditional religions, and they would incorporate those religions into Christianity, which is the religion which they were forced to adopt. They also had instances of overt resistance in which they publicly tried to resist slavery. There were slave revolts in New York in 1712, and then the Stoner Rebellion in 1739. These were instances in which enslaved people tried to take up arms against their enslavers, though they both failed and resulted in harsher slave codes and more restrictions against enslaved people in those areas. Another way in which they tried to resist their enslavement is that they would try to run away. The image on the screen is an ad which Thomas Jefferson placed in a newspaper advertising that one of his enslaved workers had run away. Runaway slave ads would be prominent throughout the entire South because slave codes guaranteed the return of enslaved people after they had run away. All right, here is your recap of everything that we've talked about. The British colonies began to adopt enslaved labor as a major source of labor, especially the southern colonies. The majority of enslaved people were sent to the West Indies. Slave codes were adopted by colonial governments to maintain control. These are the effects of the colonies turning to enslaved labor. And finally, different ways in which the enslaved people dealt with slavery, the overt and the covert ways that they resisted their enslavement. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen. And if you are looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.